We get to have a fun journey this afternoon. We get to talk about numbers. There's a famous movie, so famous I've forgotten the name of it, but I do know who started it. Tom Cruise, Cuba Gooding, and Renee Zellweger. And he was an agent for athletes. Yes. I'm glad you remember the name. I have this disease, it's called old-timer's disease. So I tend to forget things once in a while. Anyhow, Cuba Gooding said, show me the money. And so what I'd like to do today is not show you the money, because I don't have much to give you, but to show you how to manage your money, how to know if your money is working for you, so that you can be very profitable and very successful in the business. Now the title of this is A Financial Model for the Health and Fitness Industry. And I'd really rather call it Finance 101. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a basic course in finance for you as a club owner. But I want to put a very important thought in your mind. It's a very famous statement from the boss of my former company. And he told this to every employee. He said, losing money is inherently evil. He said, losing money is inherently evil. Now that sounds like a really strange statement. But if you're in business to make a living, you don't want to lose money. So he wanted us to all to think about losing money as being something evil, so we would always make money. And I put that in your mind today, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some tools to help you make money, to help you track your money, and to be a much better business person. So the first objective today will be to just go over some of the basic financial tools that are out there to help you be a better business person. The second thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to talk to you a little bit about some financial benchmarks, some numbers that are representative of good, average, and excellent club operators. Because it's always nice to know what others do, so you can tell whether you're doing a great job, a good job, or maybe just an average job. The third thing I'm going to talk about very briefly is the process of budgeting. Those of you who attended yesterday, and I'm sure some of them didn't come back after yesterday, was I talked about the importance of planning. Well, a budget is just a plan for your numbers. You've got to have a budget. If you operate a business without a budget, it'd be like rowing out in the ocean with no map. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. And then we're going to conclude with 3 core ways in which you can make more money and 3 ways in which you can save money. Because we've only got 70 minutes. And I have someone, a friend out there, has a big sign that says 0 minutes left. They will get me if I don't finish on time. So we won't get to spend a lot of time about making money. But hopefully we will cover enough. So I want to begin the journey a little bit with talking about some of the financial tools that you have at your access in this business. And I'm going to talk about them from the perspective of what's called International Accounting Federation. So it's International Accounting Standards. But the first tool we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to go over the first 4, is what's called a balance sheet. I want you to understand what a balance sheet is, and just as importantly, what you use it for. Okay? Because what a balance sheet is, it's a quick financial snapshot of your business. This basically tells you how much cash you have or how much cash you don't have. It tells you how much your business is worth and how much you owe to other people. And typically, you want to know enough about how to read a balance sheet so that you know whether your company is financially healthy or not. If you go back a few years ago in the United States, we had some really bad financial problems in our country. We had all these companies going bankrupt. Enron, Quest. It's because the CEOs were stealing money and nobody else was watching the balance sheet. If someone, including the investors, had ever bothered to look at the balance sheet, The clowns wouldn't have gotten away with stealing so much money. So that's why you want to know the balance sheet. The second thing we're going to talk about, if you're an owner, this is important, it's called a statement of owner's equity. Basically, it's a statement that tells me how my investment is doing. Where is my money? Is my money in stock? Is it in paid-in capital? Is it in dividends? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because of all the financial tools, it's probably the least important in terms of your ability to run your business successfully. The third one I'm going to talk about is called a P&L statement, otherwise known as a profit and loss statement. Okay? Sometimes called a statement of income or a statement of operations. And what it does is it really is a tool that measures your true financial performance. It measures how much money you bring in, how much money you send out the door in expenses, and after all that's done, how much do you have at the end of the day, or at the end of the week, or at the end of the month, whichever it is. And people use a profit and loss statement differently. Most clubs do one every month, and then at the end of the year. The company that I work with, and the company that I have today, which is me, I do one every single week. Because I want to know how much money I brought in each week, how much money I spent, and how much money I made. Because I have to pay somebody called Uncle Sam, which is the U.S. government. I have to write him a check every quarter for big dollars if I make money. So I want to make sure I know where I'm in, so I save enough to pay him, or save enough to escape him. Okay? So we're talking about profit and loss. And the last one, which we'll spend very little time on, is what's called a departmental income statement. And really all that is a profit and loss statement for a specific department, such as the fitness department, or for the spa, or for maybe the tennis department. Okay? And what it allows you to do is to look down really deep into how a specific department is performing. And the reason it's valuable is a lot of club owners think that they have profit departments. They think fitness is a profit department, spa is a profit department. But if they really produce one of these and dug down deep, they find they're not profit departments at all. They're profit contributors, but they're not profit departments. Because most people don't keep track of the expenses associated with a department. But I want you to know about it. In 70 minutes, you won't become a genius at it, but hopefully you'll become really good. Now, you notice I'm up here talking about financial stuff. And I'll just let you know that if I can learn it, you can learn it better. I never took an accounting class or finance class all the way through college. I thought of financial people, as they are affectionately known in the U.S. as bean counters, as people with glasses, I do fit that description, a little plastic holder in their pocket, and a bunch of pens. And I don't know if there's a word for this in Spanish, but we used to call them very anal retentive people. Okay? They sit behind a desk and they count. So I never wanted to learn about numbers until I got in the business world. Then I figured out, you know what, I do have to learn about numbers or I'll never stay in business. And I learned, and I hated it, but I took as many courses and seminars as I could. So if I can learn it, you can learn it, but you'll probably learn it better, because I was an old dog when I started learning it. You're all young puppies, and so it'll be much easier for you. So let's begin. We're going to talk about the balance sheet. The balance sheet has three parts to it. The first part is the assets. It identifies the assets you're in. Your assets are your money, your cash, the equipment that's in your club. Maybe if you own the land for your club, that's an asset. Believe it or not, if you rent the space, but you paint it and put carpet down, the carpet and the paint is an asset of your business. So you should know what your assets, what have you put into it. The second thing we're going to talk about in this balance sheet is called the liabilities. Those are the things you owe people. Okay? That's the money that you owe people. It's your bank debt. It's the fact that you're 6 months late paying the tax collector. Whatever it is, that's the liability. And the third part of the balance sheet is the owner's equity. That's the actual value of whatever that investor is, whether it's one person or it's a big venture capital company, has in your business. And these three things are important to know, because in today's financial world, there's a group of people called venture capitalists. Venture capitalists like to buy stuff, put money into it and sell it. But they have a bad habit. They don't like to put their own money into it. They like to put the bank's money into it. They like to do something we call leverage a business, which means put a lot of debt on it. And in the US now, and in the UK, there's companies that have more liabilities than they got assets. That's not a good thing. I never want to own more than what I have. That's usually a good sign that I can go out with a cup on the street in New York and start raising nickels. So we're not going to do that. So we're going to talk, we're going to start with the assets. If you have questions, feel free to ask. It may take a few moments for me to figure out the technology for you to be able to answer well, but hopefully we'll do well. And if any of you get tired or start to fall asleep, raise your hand. I'll try to be better. Okay? Because numbers are boring. Numbers can be really boring. And I'm going to try to make them exciting. And, you know, there's not a lot of stories you can tell about numbers either. I mean, one went out with 2, and 3 went out with 4. You can't do stories like you can about sales management or customer service. So I don't have as many stories to tell about numbers, at least right now. So let's start. The first part of your assets is you have what are called current assets. Current assets are things that you can turn into cold, hard cash within the next 12 months. We call it liquidate. We can make it money. That's what's called a current asset. If I can turn around and make money on it, make it into cash within 12 months, that's considered a current asset. And in the club industry, typically, most clubs have between 10 and 30% of their total assets as current. That basically means if my business was worth $1 million, I would have $100,000 to $300,000 of it that I could turn around and make into cash in a year. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So not a lot of your assets are current. Okay? The more, better to an extent, but not too much. Now, what are some examples? Well, there's always good old cash. My dad used to call it from New York, moolah, dinero. He grew up in New York. That's what we call it. You have cash. But there's other things. There's something called accounts receivable, which is considered a current asset. What an accounts receivable is, I don't know if in Argentina you do it as much as we do in the US, but we bill people on a monthly basis. We send them a bill. Well, that's our money. We send them a bill, but that person may take 60 days, 90 days to pay us. Well, that receivable, that money that's owed us, but we don't have in our pocket, is considered a current asset of the business. So if for some reason I had to close my business and liquidate, that money, that bill is my money. I can collect it from those people. It may be hard, but I can. So that is considered an example of a current asset. Your inventory. How many of you in your club sell merchandise like shoes and shorts and things like that? Raise a hand. This is also exercise, so it'll get you awake during this. Nobody wants to raise their hand. Anyhow, if you sell merchandise like protein bars or shoes, that inventory, whatever you spend on that, is considered a current asset of your business because you can turn around and sell it and generate cash. So that's your current assets, and that's part of your assets. The other side is what's called your non-current assets or long-term assets, some people would call them. And those are things that you can't turn into cash this year. It will take longer to turn around and put them into a position where they're worth something to you. They're sort of sitting in there. It would be like having money in a bank that you just couldn't take out. Okay? For example, I have an investment. I listened to my banker and I invested money in this tax-free bond for the city of Houston. And they said I could get my money out within 3 days. Well, now it's 4 months later and I can't get the money out because the city of Houston's not doing too well, but the insurance company that was insuring them is doing worse. So that's an example of what I thought was a current asset has now become a long-term asset for me. Okay? Not what I intended. Okay, but in your business, you will notice, if I put this up there, that somewhere between 70 and 90% of your assets will typically fall in the non-current status. If I were to give you an ideal percentage, I would tell you it should be around 70 to 75% of your total assets should be long-term, and 20, 25%, 30% should be short-term. And some examples of those are the property that you own. It could be the building that you own. if you are a tenant in a landlord space, whatever money that you put to fix it up, the paint, the plumbing, the electrical, that's considered a non-current asset. The exercise equipment that you buy for your club, the treadmills, the weight machines, those are all non-current assets. There's something else up there, it's called depreciation. It's actually called accumulated depreciation because it increases over the years. Accumulated depreciation means I buy this treadmill for $10,000. When it gets out of the showroom and ends up in my club, it's now worth $9,000. Next year it's worth $6,000. So that equipment's worth less. But the decrease in the value of that equipment is called accumulated depreciation. That becomes a non-current asset of my business on a financial statement. It tells me that, you know, hey, even though that's not worth as much anymore, that's how much it was worth, and that's part of my asset. When a bank comes to give me a debt, they're going to look and see and look at that. So that's your non-current assets. Okay? Now the non-current assets sit over here. If you've ever seen one of those scales, it's like this. You know, they usually put me on those, they put animals on them because they weigh heavy people. So the assets are over here. On the other side of the scale are your liabilities and your equity. And at all times, liabilities and equities should match so that the scale balances. Okay, so your assets over here. So we're now going to talk about the other side of the scale, which is the liabilities and the equity. So we're going to talk about the current liabilities. And current liabilities are those things that will come due in the next year. Those bills or payments you know you're going to have to make in the next year. And so typically, and this is important, is those current liabilities should be no more than 5 to 20% of your total assets. And maybe you notice something there is that your current assets should be smaller. I mean, your current liabilities should be smaller than your current assets. Because remember I said that your current assets should be somewhere in 10 to 30%. And now I'm saying, well, your current liabilities should be between 5 and 20. Basically, the point that should come home to you is you should always have more current assets than current liabilities. That makes sense because if those bills come due, you want to have enough money to pay them and, by the way, pay yourself. Doesn't mean everybody does that. And later on in this session, I will talk about how you can determine whether your balance statement is healthy. But examples are of things that would be current liabilities. It could be invoices that have come in from vendors that you haven't paid yet. It could be money that you owe somebody. It could be your lease payments for the next year. Believe it or not, if you're in a lease, even though you don't have to pay next month, you have to account for the next 11 months worth of lease payments as a current liability because you're going to have to pay it. You probably have to pay them all for the rest of your life, but you're going to have to account for them under current liabilities. So those are things. Okay? People have things that are called prepaid expenses where I have a lot of money, so I prepay something that's considered a current liability. And on the other side, you have your non-current liabilities, which I put here as long-term debt. So I think it's an easier name to remember. Right? And typically, as you will see, that long-term debt, those non-current liabilities should fall somewhere between 25% and 70%. Oh, what did I do there? Oh, I got it back. Saved by the bell. You saved me. What it means is that there's a big fluctuation there. Well, you'll notice though is never should your current and non-current liabilities ever add up to be equal to your assets. Worst case, the two added together is 90% of your assets, which means at the worst, 10% of your business is owner's equity. I will tell you, in the real world, you're better off 30% of your business should be in equity, 70% should be in liability, and of that 70%, it's maybe 5% current, maybe about 50%, 60% at the very most in the long term. And what's happened in the U.S. today is there's companies in our industry, there's Equinox, there's Lifetime Fitness, whose actual long-term liabilities probably are higher than the value of their business or their assets. Because they've taken out so much debt at the banks to finance growth. For example, the company that I used to be with, Club Corp, was bought by a real estate company out of Denver, Colorado called KSL. KSL bought the company for 10% down and 90% debt. Within 2 months, they financed the rest of the equity in the business. So right now, the company I used to work for is 100% leveraged, which means the owners have no ownership. The bank owns everything because it's all liabilities. Now, if they could sell the company for more than what they owe, they'll make money. The thing is, the company is worth less today than when they bought it. So it means, sort of like the homes in the U.S. right now, they pay $1.6 billion for the company. That's their debt. The company's worth about 1.2. Who's going to pay the $400 million? They will, and they haven't got it. So that's why you want to read a balance sheet so you understand this stuff. It's really, really important. I know some of the owners here that have big, large companies are looking at private equity firms. You need to be better at reading this than the guys investing, or they'll pull the wool over your eyes. So you need to understand it. But let's go back to these. Some examples, obviously, is any debt that you owe to the bank. Okay? It could be the lease on your exercise equipment. Lots of people lease their exercise equipment. So if the lease is more than a year, whatever the amount remaining after that is considered a non-current liability. For a matter of fact, if you have a 10-year lease, the next 9 years would fall as a non-current liability because you owe the money for that lease if you break that lease. Or however your lease is written, whatever you would have to pay to break it will become a non-current liability. Okay? So those are liabilities. Now let's go to the other thing, which is a statement of the owner's equity. Remember, that was the third part. Assets over here, equity and liabilities on the other side. So the owner's equity is reflective of actually what is the cash value of what my owner has put into the business, or my many owners have put into the business. Okay? And it can be, it's not just necessarily cash. Now, I'm using examples from the U.S., which may not apply here in Argentina, so I apologize in advance. In the U.S., we have things called corporations. It's called INC, Inc. In a corporation, equity could be stock. It could be common stock. It could be preferred stock. It can also be what's called retained earnings. In other words, a company can make money, and instead of passing that money out to its investors or stockholders, it keeps it in the company, maybe to reinvest it. That's called a retained earning. Okay? That's still owner's equity because that's your money. It just happens to be staying in the business. It hasn't gone in your pocket. Okay? Okay? It can also be something that's called paid-in capital. When an entrepreneur starts a company, I'm an entrepreneur. I took some of my own money and put it into the company to make sure that company would survive. That's my equity there. So that's called paid-in capital. That's another example of owner's equity. Okay. And then in our country, we have things called partnerships, and we have things called limited liability companies. We have things called sole proprietors and S-corps. The U.S., just tidbit of information for you, 90% of the attorneys in the world live and practice in the United States. Okay? So we're the most screwed up country of all because we have all those attorneys. Okay? And that's why we have all these corporate structures. But the point is there's still lots of different ways to account for your equity. The thing that you have to know is that your liabilities plus your equity have to equal your assets. Liabilities plus equity must always equal the asset value of the business. If they don't, the scale tips. Okay? And since it's a three-pronged scale, if you have too much liability, not enough equity, or not enough asset, then the scale gets all messed up. You should produce a balance sheet. Typically, you would want to produce it probably on a monthly basis. Okay? And you know what? Every month it will look different because your cash in the bank will be different. Your property value may have changed. You may have more debt than you thought. You may have taxes coming due. All types of things can influence. So that's the balance sheet. And I put a picture of a balance sheet up here. Now, you're adults, so I won't read all the numbers up to you, but that's exactly how a balance sheet would look. My question is, how many of you produce one of these every single month. How many in this room do that? I see a great hand in the back. I see a few hands. That's excellent. Outstanding. Excelente. Problem is that wasn't enough hands. I would hope that next year, Guerrero will tell me that when someone else asks that question, every hand in this room goes up. Because that's what it should be. Okay? Matter of fact, someone asked me, said, Steve, you're a one-person company. You're one little itty-bitty person. How come you do it? I do an annual budget. I do quarterly forecasts. I print out my balance sheet every 2 weeks. I print out my P&L every week, and I look at it. And they say, you got to be nuts. You're one person. You know what's going on. Another tidbit from my old chairman is, know your numbers. The leader who doesn't know their numbers doesn't know their business. And a leader that doesn't know their business is a leader who won't have a business for very long. I see someone laughing back there, and he knows exactly what I'm saying. It's so important. So I picked up that trend. And just as an FYI, my business is several $100,000 a year business. I used to be responsible for $400 million a year. What I did with $400 million is what I do with several $100,000. I treat it the same. It's money. It's my livelihood. It's my business. So know the balance sheet. So now let's get away from it. We're going to talk about, I believe that should say, I'm trying not to even look at my PowerPoint here. I can't anyhow. But that should say the P&L statement. See, I told you the computer wouldn't work here. It goes out. So we're going to talk about the profit and loss statement, which really is a tracking of your revenues and your expenses on a regular basis. Okay? And I'm going to talk about the parts of it. But the first thing, I'm going to make a point. A profit and loss statement can be produced for any period of time you want. Most people will produce an annual profit and loss statement. Some people will produce one every quarter. Smart people produce one every month. Really smart people produce one every single week. Okay? Why? Because they want to know their numbers. How much money am I bringing in? How many expenses am I sending out the door? And what am I keeping so I can put on my balance sheet? So I'm going to make that point first. And I knew I'd come up with a story. I knew you guys want a story. I could just see in your eyes you're getting bored with numbers. Okay? So I'll tell you my first example of why it was so important to know my numbers. I had just started at the Atrium Club in New York. I was the director of fitness. I was the number 2 person in the club. I had about 100 employees. And the manager comes down, and I'd only been on the job a couple of weeks, and I think he did this to me in person. He says, Mr. Deadman's coming to town. I said, so, who's he? Well, he's the chairman of the company. So I said, so? He says, I think, Steve, you better know your numbers. What? He says, Mr. Deadman will know your numbers. I said, you got to be kidding me. The guy's in Dallas. He's got 220 clubs. He's not going to know what my department is doing. So I didn't listen to my manager. I was, young, vibrant, cocky, stupid, whatever the case would be. And so Mr. Deadman comes in. He comes in the club and he shakes hands and says, it's nice, Steve. Welcome to the company. He says, Steve, I noticed your personal training revenues were down last month. Can you tell me why you were $20,000 under? I go, oh my God, this guy knows exactly what I did. Never again did I get caught. You could be in an elevator with Robert Deadman, and he would ask you, Steve, how are your numbers? And you better not try to BS him. I don't know if there's a term for BS in Spanish. BS is... No, BS. I don't know how to put that without being impolite. Great big liar. How about that? So don't tell a lie to the chairman because he'll know what the real answer was. So that's where I learned how important it was to do this stuff. So here we're talking about a profit and loss. I want to talk about the general categories. The first category is what we call revenue departments. Every profit and loss statement, every club ought to keep track of revenue departments. And what revenue departments are the departments that generate money. Membership department, fitness department. If you're big in personal training, you may want to even create a personal training department. The spa, the tennis department. If you have a kids area, and if you charge for kids program, the kids department could be a revenue department. But on the P&L statement, you will have a line that says revenue, and underneath it, you'll have every department that produces revenue. And next to it, you should have, and I'll show a picture pretty soon of what those are, what those revenues are. The second one on there are what are called the operating department expenses. These are the expenses that are associated with operating a specific revenue department. So, for example, an operating department expense may be the payroll associated with the fitness department. So for every department in my club, membership, fitness, spa, tennis, I have revenues. I also have these operating department expenses. Payroll, supplies, whatever expenses associated with generating those dollars in that department. I hope that makes sense. This is a whirlwind tour. Okay? The third category is what's called undistributed operating expenses. Undistributed, meaning it's not credited to any one of those revenue departments. It's sort of out there floating around. Okay? Examples of an undistributed expense would be sales and marketing expenses. There's an area that we call G&A, which is basically the manager and the accounting department. It's an undistributed expense. There's the utility costs. That would be an undistributed expense. We put it in a separate category. We don't count it against those revenue departments. So it's called undistributed. Okay? But the fourth one I have there is what's called the gross profit of the business, or the operating profit of the business. Young ladies, how am I doing? Am I going too fast for you? I don't look as pretty when I do that like you do. So. Okay. So the operating departments. The operating profit, what that is my department revenues minus my department expenses minus my undistributed expenses. That's my operating profit. That's basically saying that's how much money I make after all the revenues, and I subtract out the department expenses and those undistributed expenses. It tells me how healthy I am. Now, the next thing down, you'll see when I put up on a sheet of paper, is what are called fixed expenses. Those are expenses that operationally you don't really influence in your business. Rent is a fixed expense. You sign a lease, you're going to pay that every month. You pretty much know it. There's not a lot operationally you can do to change rent. There's other things you can do to try to change rent, like not pay it, but it's still fixed. Okay? Taxes. We say in the United States, two things are for sure: death and taxes. They always happen. Okay? Can't get out of it. So taxes are considered a fixed expense. Okay? So that's sort of what fixed expense is. Insurance. In the U.S., clubs have to have property insurance, general liability insurance, professional liability insurance, because we sue people a lot. So we've got to have lots of insurance. So we spend lots of money to insure ourselves against our members suing us or our employees suing us. That becomes a fixed expense because once the insurance company says, here's your bill, it stays the same or it goes up. And no matter what I do operationally, the chances are I can't impact it. In the U.S., maybe other places in the world you're fortunate. Then underneath that fixed expense is this funky word. It's EBITDA, called EBITDA. Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It is probably, in the financial world, the most important number to know about your business. You gotta know them all, but you better know this one. EBITDA represents how much money you make after you take your revenues and you subtract out all your department expenses, your undistributed expenses, and your fixed expenses. Basically, it's all the money you make before you have to pay interest and principal to the bank and account for depreciation, is what it is. Okay? And most businesses today are valued based on some multiple of their EBITDA. So, for example, about a year and a half ago, a company called Related Properties bought Equinox Fitness in New York City, and they paid 13 times EBITDA to buy it. That's a lot. That's a big one. The typical in our industry is to pay 4 to 6 times. So this company thought they were smart, so they paid 13 times. Okay? So if you know your EBITDA, you can get an idea of what the cash flow value of your business is. I wish I could take a lot of time to explain that, but that's gives a chance for me to come back here and give another talk. Another boring talk on money. Okay? Underneath EBITDA is what's called NOI, Net Operating Income. That's all the money I make before I pay my final set of taxes to the government. That's taking all my revenues, subtracting all those funky expenses out. Distributed department expenses, undistributed expenses, fixed expenses, paying the bank its interest, paying it its principal, accounting for depreciation. NOI is everything I can put in my back pocket before I have to reach back into that pocket and pay the government. Okay, does it make sense? And last, at the very bottom, is the net cash flow. That's actually what I get to take home with me. Okay? And the funny thing is that usually for every dollar you generate in revenue, if you can take 6 or 7 cents of that back home with you, you're doing a really good job. That's in our business. If you were in the grocery store business, you would be lucky if you took 1 penny of every dollar home with you. They're much worse than us. They have a hard time making money. They make a lot of revenues, but they spend a lot of money. So that is that. So I'm going to take a few moments and just talk a little bit about each of those little areas a little bit more detail. Because I know you're thrilled and excited to be hearing about these numbers. Okay? So we're going to talk about these revenue departments. Okay? And I've listed some of the revenue departments up here and given you some percentages. So for example, the membership department is a revenue department. In most clubs throughout the world, anywhere from 60 to 80% of the revenues of the business are generated by the membership department. Underneath that is called GIMNASIO, which in the U.S. we call fitness. I have yet to figure out why everybody in the world calls fitness gym, and we in the U.S. call it fitness. I'm beginning to think we're wrong and you're right, because nobody else calls it like we do. Typically, that runs anywhere from 10% to 25% of the revenues that your club can produce. The Reebok Club in New York City produces 25% of its overall revenues from personal training, not just fitness, just personal training. It generates $7 million a year in personal training revenue. It's a lot of personal training revenue. Most clubs don't make that much money. Okay? And then, for example, the spa, I mentioned it, if you have a spa, massage, facials, manicures, that should be able to generate 5 to 10% of the money that your business makes. And I listed other departments which are sort of small, whether it's a cafe or a grill or a restaurant that you have, or whether it's tennis department. If you do have a big tennis program, I went to see the Villas Club. I remember where Marlo Villas, because actually I'm an old guy, and he's about my age, and my cousin played at Wimbledon at the U.S. Open. Her name was Stephanie DeFina, and she introduced me to him. But anyhow, he has 12 of the most beautiful clay courts I've ever seen. And he charges court reservations after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Smart thing. In the U.S., clubs that have tennis courts make a lot of money. Tennis does. At the San Francisco Tennis Club in New York, or in San Francisco Tennis Club in San Francisco, I'm doing real good here. They do $1.5 million just in tennis revenue, just tennis. Brookhaven Country Club in Dallas, Texas, does $4.5 million in tennis revenue only, from individual lessons, group lessons, kids camps, court reservations, you name it. So if you got tennis and you know what you're doing, you can make lots of money. And it can be a big percentage. In some tennis clubs, tennis is as much as 50% of the revenue. So those are your revenue departments. And then we talked a little bit about the department expenses. I just wanted to show you what they were. Payroll is your biggest expense. Payroll is wages, salaries, bonuses, commissions. I have to get out of the way of the camera. I'm not like Justin. I don't pose as well in front of a camera, so I want to make sure he gets the slide. Okay? So one of the biggest expenses is Justin here to hear that? He's probably not. I don't have that pretty boy face that he does. You know? Where is he? I hear his voice. Can't mistake it. Oh, look. Hi, Justin. How you doing? That's from all those years of rugby, all getting hit in the face. It's really improved the shape. It comes out good on camera. Anyhow, The salaries are the biggest part of your department expenses, 35 to 45%. I will tell you, if you run a fitness department that doesn't do a lot of personal training, it could be as much as 70% of your expenses. Tennis commissions. In the U.S., tennis pros probably make 80% of the revenues they generate. So some departments, the salary eats up a lot of the revenue they make. That's why I don't want to call them profit departments, I call them revenue departments. And I didn't put all these statistics up there for you, but if you ask later, I'll be glad to give to you. Other things such as your benefits package, your education, how you spend money to train people, the supplies you buy. If you're talking about the fitness department, maybe the cost for towels to put out there at fitness school. Maybe the cost to have someone come in and repair your equipment. Those are all expenses that would fall under departmental expenses. Then I mentioned to you before about the undistributed expenses. Those things which are not tied to any specific revenue, but are sort of out there floating around in the universe. Sales and marketing. In the great clubs in the U.S., they will spend somewhere between 4 and 5% of their revenues on sales and marketing. That's for like direct mail pieces, advertisements in the paper like they're out there, or TV ads or things like that. It's getting easier to spend less today because of the internet, but that's still what they do. Then you have, oh my gosh, I can't serve it, this utilities. I'm starting to be able to read a little bit of Spanish and figure out utilities. Your utilities run anywhere from 4 to 6% of your revenues in the U.S. and in the UK. So it's a pretty big undistributed expenses. If I put that into a cost that makes more sense, utilities usually run somewhere between $2.50 a foot to $4 a foot. So that would be, I can't convert that, I'm sorry, to meters. My math isn't that good, but it's about $2.50 to $4 a square foot for utilities. So that's one of your big undistributed expenses. And then the other one that's pretty big down here is this one, which is 3 to 5%, which is your capital replacement. When we talk briefly about budgeting, everybody needs to budget for capital replacement. Those are funds that you set aside so that you can always buy new equipment and replace equipment every single year. Remember how Jay said putting something new in helps? Well, you should budget for it. And the good clubs spend 3 to 5% of their revenues on getting new stuff every year. My friend Red Laurel has a saying, it's one new thing a month. He gets one new thing a month for his members, equipment or whatever, but he budgets for it. And that's what he spends. And then those are the others. And then over here are some of the fixed expenses. The two that I'll talk about. The top one is what are called management fees. Just by a show of hands, how many people here have a company that has multiple clubs that they operate? Raise your hands. I know who some of you are already, but just wanted to see it. Okay? In the U.S. and the UK, what they do, okay, very good. If I own multiple clubs, I usually charge a management fee to my clubs. My corporate office does. Somewhere in the range of 3 to 6% of that club's revenues. So, for example, the Club Corp. Club Corp owned 220 clubs at one time. We charged each one of those clubs a management fee equal to 3 to 6% of that particular club's revenues. That's a fixed expense. Equinox does it, Lifetime Fitness does it, Saks out of Scandinavia does it, David Lloyd Leisure out of the UK does it. I haven't talked to Richard at Compania Athletica, but he's a wise businessman, so I'm pretty confident he probably does that with his clubs as well. The biggest fixed expense is rent. And I put a range up here for you. It's 10 to 15%. What I'm saying is that in a typical club, their rent is somewhere between 10% and 15% of the revenues. Ideally, it should be between 8 and 12%. But as an industry, we average 10 to 15%. But I will tell you, never, ever let your rent exceed 15% of your gross revenues. Just don't let it happen. It's the easiest way to go out of business. So if you're looking at purchasing a new club or developing a new club, calculate what your revenues are going to be and what your rent's going to be. And if that rent looks like it's going to be more than 15%, that's a red flag that goes up and says, I don't think I ought to do that deal. Not unless I can negotiate. So those are your fixed expenses. Okay? Are we doing okay? I know this is not like fantasy land, but I'm trying to make numbers interesting. So this is EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's that big important number. That's the money you make before you pay the bank and pay the government. And I just put some ranges in there. If your EBITDA equals 15 to 20% of your revenues, you're doing a fair job. Now, if you can get your EBITDA to be between 20 and 25%, you're doing bueno. If you can get your EBITDA from 25 to 30%, you're doing excelente. And then if you can do above 30%, please let me work for you. Because that's really incredible. Just to give you an idea. Anybody want to hire me? No. Okay. Just to give you an idea, the URSA average for EBITDA is 17%. So the average URSA club is fair. Okay. The company called Town Sports International out of New York, which is a $600 million company. They do 21%, so they barely get into the good range. Lifetime Fitness, which is supposed to be the best, used to be up at 30%, now they're down around 25%. So they went from being extraordinary to excellent, and they're about to embark on becoming very good. So it's not easy to get a high percentage. There is a club that I am familiar with in Houston that pulls about 35% to EBITDA. But when you make 36 million and you can put 12 million in the bank, you're doing a really good job. So, but you should know those ranges. If you knew those ranges, that's something you could go back and look at your club and say, am I doing fair, good, excellent, or I can go out and hire anybody because I'm just blowing the doors off. That's an important number. The other one here is net operating income, and I'm not going to, you can read this, but that's basically the money you have left before you pay the government, okay? Those are percentages. So if you can be between 8 and 10% before you pay taxes in our business, according to industry statistics, you're doing a pretty extraordinary job. If you're doing better than this now, you need to come to the U.S. and teach us. And I imagine there are some of you in this room that actually do better than this. Okay? And this was just to show you what a P&L statement looks like. And I won't read all the numbers, but I do want to show you something that's important. Notice how I have, over here, I have year-to-date actual, then I have year-to-date plan, and I have year-to-date variance. Whenever you produce a profit and loss statement, you want to know what your plan was, what your actual is, and what your variance to plan was. Okay? Those three columns you've got to have. And notice that I have them for the revenue departments, the departmental expenses, the undistributed expenses. I have them for all those things I just talked about. Okay? At Club Corp, here's what we did. We had our weekly plan, our weekly actual, our weekly variance, our month-to-date actual, our month-to-date plan, our month-to-date variance, our year-to-date actual, our year-to-date plan, our year-to-date variance. I knew by the week, by the month, by the year, what I did, what my plan was, and what my variance was. You know what that helped me do? Take the right actions to make sure I always stayed on plan or ahead. So that's just a great example to show you. I like that. Okay. Now, my timekeepers, how am I doing? How much time do I have? I guess I have more than 15 minutes because I haven't stuck my sign with it. I want to share with you some benchmarks because I thought it would be pretty interesting. This shows revenue per club, and almost all of those same. What I have on my right or your left is all URSA clubs. Next to it, I have URSA clubs that are over 6,000 meters. Next to that, I have a company called Lifetime Fitness, which is an $800 million company in the U.S. Next to that, I have a company called SAS, which has about 180 clubs throughout Scandinavia, an outstanding public company. Next to that, I have a company called TSI, which is out of New York, which is about a $700 million company. And then I have the last two, which came from a survey that I did of the 50 best clubs in the world that I knew of. I didn't know them all, but I did know 50 what I thought were the greatest clubs. And I got all their data. And as you can see, for the average Ursa club makes $2 million a year in revenues. You can see that a Lifetime Fitness makes almost $8 million a year. You can see the average best of the best club does $15 million a year in revenue. Folks, there's a lot of opportunity in this business. That's just revenue per club. I don't know if that's so important for you to know, but I think this other one is. It's called revenue per member. Because the most important thing in our business is what? What's the most important thing in our business? Members. So the more revenue I can make per member, the better. So this shows revenue per member. If you look over, the average Ursa club makes about $600 per member per year. If I go over to Lifetime Fitness, they make about $1,200 per member per year. My average best of the best club makes over $3,000 per member per year. Figure this out for your own club. Figure out what your revenue per member is. How does it compare to these? The next one is what's called revenue per square foot. It's a very important metric to know. I like to think revenue per member is more important, but revenue per square foot is good. Okay? And again, this shows all the different clubs, and it can show from an Ursa club at $60 a foot to clubs like TSI and the best of the best that are $120 a square foot. So there's clubs out there that are, and this is something you could probably figure out. How much revenue per square foot are you doing? And I really think that, I always believe, like Justin said the other day, on what's called a big, hairy, audacious goal. Your big, hairy, audacious goal ought to be exceed the best of the best. You don't want to be like Ursa average. Not that I don't like Ursa, you just don't want to be average. You know? That might be like being average at football. Who wants to be average at football? Okay? Okay? I believe this is percentage of revenue that comes from membership. And it just shows that in almost all clubs, it's pretty consistent between 60 and 80% of the revenue. So even the best of the best or the average tend to generate the same percentage from membership, which means the real opportunity lies on what you can get your members to spend outside of their dues. It's incremental spend. How much can you get me to spend? And this is just a graph. This is just from the best of the best. I'm not going to leave it up there long. I wanted you to see it. Again, hopefully Grandma will be kind enough to make sure anybody who needs this can get a copy of it. But it just shows percentages. Average is blue. I believe it's yellow is low, and the white is high. So it shows by category. So it shows for personal training. There's clubs that make a couple of percent to some that make 20% from personal training. There's a club here that generates 30% of its revenue from spa. So it can show there's quite a bit of fluctuation in our industry as to what you can make. I just thought it'd be a nice benchmark to show. And in the last two benchmarks, I believe this is payroll as a percentage of revenue. And you can see for the average Ursa club, it's around 40%, 42%. For the SATs, it's right around 40. TSI, it's around 40. And the best of the best, it drops down to 35%. And you're saying, does that mean they have less employees? Actually, the reason the best of the best clubs spend a lower percentage on their employees is not because they pay them less. They actually pay them far more. It's that they're very productive. The average employee in the best of the best generates twice as much member as that in the average club. In other words, the employees are that much more productive. They're money machines. Great employees are money machines. And so you pay them really well to make your money. So last statistic, this is EBITDA percentages. And as you can see, the average Ursa club's at 17. Lifetime was up at 27 when I did this. The best of the best clubs are up around 27, 28%. So that's what I'm saying. It's achievable to get an EBITDA of 28% of revenues. It's not unheard of. There's 50 clubs in there that average that. That's a lot of clubs. And that's not 50, that's 50 club companies that had anywhere from 2 clubs to about 30 clubs that I surveyed. So, we're doing okay. No more statistics. Okay? Just some other important ratios to show you. Okay? I'm taking my watch off. This way I can read the Fifth Amendment in the U.S. I didn't know what time it was. You're very much looking at me there. See, I'm smart. No knowledge can't be held accountable. That's like you. If you don't keep your numbers, I can't hold you accountable for how well your club does. Okay? The top one is what's called the current ratio. This is a number you should know. The current ratio is the ratio of your current assets to your current liabilities. Take your current assets and you divide them by your current liabilities and you come up with a number. Somewhere from 0 to wherever. Okay? If your current ratio is 2, the investment world will love you. That means you have twice as much current assets as you have current liabilities. You will be chased by every investor around. If it's between 1 and 2, most investors will say you're still doing a great job. If your current ratio is above 1, but less than 2, you're still doing great. When you're between 0.6 and 1, you're average. That doesn't seem, it would seem strange that 0.6 would be average, because that would mean you have less assets than you have liabilities. I will tell you right now, you should never accept a number under 1 for that. You should be, if anybody here is a CEO, and I know there's a lot of CEOs here, think 1 and above. 1 and above, that's where you want to be. The second number here is called return on equity, ROE, return on equity. That's the cash that I make for the equity I put into my company. And return on equity is done on a year-in, year-out basis. Okay? In the industry, an investor likes to get somewhere between 10% and 20% return on equity. And I'll just give you an example. If I took $1 million and invested it in your club, what's your name?
Adi.
I invested $1 million in this club. He says, please do. Okay? I would expect him to pay me $100,000 a year back. That's a 10% return on equity. Okay, that's all it is. Okay, but that makes sense. If I put $1 million in, I expect every year that I'm in that business to get $100,000 out. It's a 10% return on equity. That's what investors like. You have to speak their language. Okay? The other one that I want you to know is this next one, and this is debt to equity. I had to think. I'm trying to be a good speaker and not refer to my notes. Could be dangerous. This is debt to equity. This means how much debt do I have and how much cash do I have. Equity. Talk about your owner's equity statement. That's why it's important to know. Okay. You'll notice it's I think I put the range up here. In the ERSA statistics, it ranges from anywhere from 1/10 to 3.3 with an average of about 1.1. That means I have the same amount of debt as I have equity. That's really, really good. Most venture capital firms are like 4. They like to have 4 times the debt than do equity. For a matter of fact, some of them it's 5 to 1. And if some of you are going to do business with venture capitalists, they're going to say, oh, it's okay to have a debt to equity ratio of 5 or 6 or 4. Let me tell you, if you're a good business person, you never want to do that. Now, they're MBAs and they're smart financial people, but they don't know how to run a business. They know how to analyze it. So I would just encourage you to know what that number is for your business. And the last one I have here is, it actually isn't the last one, it's debt to EBITDA, okay? It's a debt to EBITDA. It's how much debt do you have to the EBITDA. Think about it, your debt is what you owe people. The EBITDA is really basically the money you make. And ideally, you want your debt to EBITDA ratio to be under 3. Ideally, and I had some numbers in here, was 2 to 3. But you want to be under 3. You don't want your debt to be more than 3 times your earnings, your EBITDA. Some people may let it creep to 3 to 4. But when your debt to EBITDA gets somewhere between 3 to 4, get ready to go to the bank because you may have some problems. And then when it gets over 4, then that's real dangerous. And I just wanted you to know those numbers. And the last one that I had down at the bottom is what's called the debt coverage ratio. Okay? And what that is to the banks. And this is an important one for the banks if you're going to work with a bank. Debt coverage is basically saying, do you have the ability to cover your debt? And you want to have a number somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5. What that means is that your EBITDA is 1.3 to 1.5 times as much as your principal and interest payments for that year. Hopefully that makes sense. It's tough to do some of this big stuff in such a short period. But this number is important. You know, your debt coverage ratio is your ability to pay your debts. You want it to be 1.3 to 1.5. Oh, okay. You doing okay? You didn't hold a sign up for me yet. You did. Oh, I didn't see. You know why? Because not that you're not beautiful, but this audience is so wonderful, I just didn't think to look over it. Okay? So let's talk about budgeting. I'm going to be real brief with budgeting. Budgeting, I will tell you right now, this is your key to success. Everybody, how many people, please respond. I want audience participation. How many of you do an annual budget for your clubs? Raise of hands. Join me. I'll bet you that's a little over 50%. That's good. Again, next year, Guillermo's going to report to me that I got 100% of the hands up. You all need to do a budget, okay? I'm going to hold him accountable to report, okay? And if you guys don't all do a budget next year, then the next World Cup, the U.S. is going to beat Argentina. Do you believe that? No. But I'll put the hoax on you if you guys don't do your budgets. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is a trend line budget. A trend line budget is what you do if you have an existing business. What a trend line means is you go back and you analyze your prior year's performance and you graph it. And I put an example up here of a club for 5 years and I graphed their EBITDA. As you can see, it's sort of a straight line going up. That's a really nice graph to see for EBITDA. Now, I wouldn't just do EBITDA, you do it for everything. Revenues, personal training revenues, payroll, whatever. But that's what a trend line is. I go back and I look at historically what I've done. And then what I do is I say, okay, that's what I've historically done. What do I think is going to impact me this coming year? I make those assumptions and I apply it to that trend. So I might take that graph and I might continue it up for this next year, or I might flatten it out a little bit because I know 3 new clubs are moving into my market. So a trend line budgeting process is I have to sit down and look at every revenue, every expense, and I graph it out for the last couple of years, and I see where it's at. And I, what we call extrapolate, where I think it's going to go the next year. I take assumptions like, well, you know, next year we're going to raise the dues. Okay, well then I think I'll let membership revenues go up a little more. We're going to add 2 new personal trainers. Well, maybe I better take expenses up a little bit like this. And what you can do then is you can easily predict what your budget's going to be, because a budget is nothing more than an extremely accurate prediction. Okay? But it becomes your roadmap. So that's what a trend line budget is. I didn't want to spend much more time. I can ask that later. The second type of budget, though, is what's called a zero-based budget. You use a zero-based budget when you don't have any historical information. If you were opening it, how many of you have opened a club within the last year? So I saw a few hands, hand here. If you're just opening a club, you don't have any historical data. So you have to do what's called a zero-based budget. You have to start from scratch. And you have to make assumptions. And I put a little chart here for maybe a fitness department, just to give an example. If I'm doing a zero-based budget, I would take, for example, personal training at the top and say, I believe I'm going to be able to do 100 personal trainings a week. And I plan on charging $50 for it, which means I'll make $5,000 in a week, I'll make $260,000 for the year. That's what a zero-based budget is. I make an assumption about volume, I make an assumption about price, which allows me to determine what I believe I'll make for a week, and then I just take that out for a year. That's the process of zero-based budgeting. But you'd have to do that for every revenue category and every expense category. And I tell people, not only when you're starting up, if I hire a new department head, if my club was 20 years old and I hired a new manager, I'd make my manager do a zero-based budget the first year he was there. Because I want him to understand his business. I want him to understand what type of volume he does, what type of pricing he's going to use. I want him to really, really know. So that's what a zero-based budget is. You should do that every year. At the beginning of my talk, I talked about a process called forecasting, which after much consideration, I felt there wasn't enough time here to talk about. Forecasting is when you take your budget and then you look at your actuals and your budget and you actually forecast where you're going to go. So we'll just stick to the 2 types of budgeting, trend line and zero-based. And now we're going to talk about the last 2 areas. 3 ways in which you can improve your revenues, 3 ways that you need to be looking at to manage your expenses as a professional manager. So the first way that you can help drive revenues is increase pricing. Pricing is obviously one tool. Increase your membership dues, you increase your personal training fee, whatever that may happen to be, okay? But the point being is that there's some things that help you drive price. In the U.S., we have what's called CPI, Consumer Price Index. I don't know what it is in Argentina. I know in Europe it's the cost of living index, which is how much does the cost of living go up every year. Typically, if you're a smart club operator, you always raise your prices every year to at least equal the cost of living increase. So the cost of living in Argentina went up 3% last year. In your budget, you want to raise your pricing 3%. Why? Your cost just went up 3%. If you don't raise your pricing, what are you doing? You're giving it to your customer cheaper. You're taking money from your pocket and you're giving it to their pocket. Okay? That's called a charitable donation. That's not running a profitable business. Okay? So what I want you to think is, what is the cost of living index in your country? Interesting, someone said, why do you talk about Russia so much? Just happen to be working there right now. Their cost of living increase last year was 14.7%. The cost of living in Russia went up almost 15% in 1 year. It's done that for like the last 6 years. It's gotten pretty expensive. Well, they could consider raising their prices that much. I doubt they do, but they could, because that's what the cost of living is. The other thing that's more important to driving pricing is a supply and a demand. When you have greater demand than you have supply, you can control your pricing and do what you want with it. If there's greater supply than there is demand, then you can't increase pricing. So let's say you have 2 massage rooms, and you're doing 100 massages a week, and people are waiting in line to get into the massage room. That's your time to increase the pricing. The other side of the coin is your massage rooms are sitting empty. That's not the time to increase the pricing. So supply and demand. Of all the 3 ways I'm going to tell you to generate money, that's the least effective. You don't want to have to depend on price increases to drive revenue. It helps, but you don't want to be dependent upon that. That's sort of like a crutch. But I will tell you, we had a motto in our company. It was 5% or bust. We increased membership pricing 5% every year, no matter what. Because we believed we were valuable. I believe you're all valuable, and I think, it's not a bad mindset to have. The second way is to increase volume. This is a much better way to drive revenue, is to increase volume, to sell more. But you know what you got to do when you sell more? You got to have a sales plan, like we talked about yesterday. And your trainers, your massage therapists, and your manager, and your salespeople, they got to have a sales plan. And you got to set some targets for them. And then you got to provide them training and tools so they can sell better. The reason Equinox generates so much personal training revenue is not because they charge the highest prices, though they're pretty high. It's that they sell it. And when a person joins Equinox, the membership person is selling them a package of personal training. When the trainer's out on the floor, they're servicing the members, and they're selling personal training. People have a sales mentality. And by the way, they all have a plan. If you're a personal trainer at Equinox, you've got a sales plan. And guess what happens if 3 months in a row you don't hit your sales plan? Guess where you end up? You're not at Equinox anymore. You're somewhere else. So sales volume is important. Okay? And volume comes from having a sales plan for each individual, creating realistic targets, all the things I talked about yesterday. To me, that's a much more effective way to drive revenue. And the third way, which I also think is really good, is coming up with new and innovative products. Okay? In his book, Funky Business Revisited, I know that my dear friend Justin told you about reading Good to Great. Great book. The 5 dysfunctions of a team he mentioned yesterday. Good book to read. I think an even better book to read is a book called Funky Business Revisited. Go online. And he talks about this one. He says the biggest weakness in the global economy is something called karaoke capitalism. Anybody know what karaoke capitalism is? Does anybody know what karaoke is? Where I go upstage and I pretend to be Elvis. It'd be really hard to visualize now, I know. And I try to sing that. But what karaoke capitalism means is that everybody just copies everybody else. You can't generate much revenue that way. But if you're innovative and creative, you come up with new programs and new ways to do things and new ways to charge for those new things, you can generate a bunch of money. I think I shared with you the story the other day about how I charged for the chairs on the sun deck. I don't know if that's innovative. I thought it was, and it made me a lot of money. It was a new service. They charged for it. What could you do differently? Could you? I got to give you a story. I haven't had many stories today. My friend Don Evans, the guy I told you that came out of the ceiling on the rope and the camouflage, he also had a special exercise course that was called SWAT Week. It's after the police forces, and you paid $150 for the week to come in at 5:30 every morning for 5 days. So you paid him, or his club, $150 per person to get up at 5 in the morning so you could be at the club at 5:30. But when you got to the club, you didn't get in the club. He had rented a U-Haul truck, and you all got in the back of the U-Haul truck. And he took the U-Haul truck and drove you to a warehouse that you had no idea where it was. And he opened it up, and he had set it up like a battle scene. And you all got those paintball things, and you did a workout where you had to crawl, shoot, climb, shoot, do all that. Innovative, different approach to a group exercise class. You have 50 people at $150, $7,500 a week. I'm happy as the manager. Okay, that's innovative. That's the other way that you drive revenues. Is be innovative and creative. Okay? And I wish I had time. This is my favorite area, is being innovative. Now let's talk about controlling expenses. I'm going to think it's important to manage the expenses. Because as you look, at the end of the day, after you pay your government, how much do most of us end up with? About 6 to 10 cents out of every dollar. So we don't want to waste money. Okay? We want to save it. Okay? We want all that. So you got to control, but I'm going to give you a lesson. And if you're in a rowboat, okay, and you're trying to row across the ocean, there's two ways to get there. You have more revenue, you put more effort into it, you get across. Or you save expenses. You know, you throw one oar overboard, you throw the other oar overboard, it's less weight, you don't have to row as much. But if you throw both oars overboard, what happens? You ain't got nothing to row with but your hands. Do that for a while, shark's probably going to bite one hand off. Now you only have one hand to go. The point I'm trying to make is that if you try to make money by cutting expenses all the time, you will end up without a profit. Drive the top, which is the revenues, manage the bottom, which is the expenses. Okay? In his book, Funky Business Revisited, and I love this term, maybe it's because I live in Texas, he calls it Texas Chainsaw Massacre Management. Anybody ever seen the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre? It's a true story. It's about a nutcase that lived in Texas who had a chainsaw. He went around killing people by sawing off their heads and their arms and legs. He's a true guy in Texas. That's where I come from. That's what we're like. Okay? Well, he was saying there's people out there who believe they can make money by cutting all their employees, by cutting their expenses. You can't do it. You got to drive revenue. But you do have to manage expenses. So the three ways you do it is you control payroll. You've got to control wages. Wages make up over 40% of our expenses. Thank you. So you got to control your wages. And one of the ways to do it, I don't know in Argentina if you deal with what we deal with in the States, we have a thing called overtime pay in the United States. You're only allowed to let an employee work 40 hours. If he works more than 40 hours, I get the luxury of paying him time and a half. And if it's a holiday, I get the luxury of paying him twice as much as he normally makes. Good managers will control it to make sure people never have overtime. And what that really means is that you really need to manage your schedules. Eliminate redundancies in your schedule. If at the front desk you always have 2 people working, well, if there's a time during the day where hardly anybody comes in, don't schedule that second person then. You don't have to schedule employees for 40 hours. I scheduled every one of my employees for 36 hours, not 40. Basically, I eliminated 10% of their schedule because there was redundancy in there. But that 10% was 10% payroll I saved. I never had to fire an employee because I had to cut expenses, because I kept them under 40 hours. So eliminate redundancies. Look at your traffic. If it's a slow time of the day, do you really need to have that employee there? Could a manager who's on duty cover the floor for that 1 hour so that you don't have to pay for that 1 hour? Little things like that save big dollars, and it doesn't decrease morale by eliminating people. That's the first thing. The second thing, the second big thing that most businesses can do much better is controlling their inventories. And I'm not just talking inventory of retail items that you would sell in a pro shop, but I'm talking about the towels, the hand soap, the shampoo. It's called a par stock process. I monitor and know how much of something I use in a month, and I only buy a month's worth of inventory at a time. And I have a check sheet. You can do it on a computer. I had it on a piece of paper in every storage closet. And every time someone took out a paper towel, took out toilet paper, took out shampoo, they had to check it. And I knew when I got to a certain level, I had to order one more month. What that did is that prevented me from having any excess inventory. And you're saying this guy has got to be nuts. But what happens in the club business, and I know it in the States, in the UK, in Germany, it happens in Japan, China, I've worked in China, they all do the same thing. They order a ton of supplies, and all of a sudden they look in the closet and they're out of it, and they order 4 months worth, and they have this huge bill that comes in. If you keep a par stock raw material, you're never going to order more than a month's worth of stuff. You will manage your expenses, not eliminate them, manage them. And the third big thing, I'm going down here, I'm doing pretty good. Third thing that you have to do is try to negotiate the big expenses. If you have a lease and revenues aren't quite where they are, can you go talk to your landlord and renegotiate or restructure your lease? Can you talk to your insurance company and try to get the insurance rate down just a little bit? I know everybody says it's impossible, but nothing is impossible, I believe. You know, if you believe you can do it, you can do it. You see, you're smiling, you know that. Okay? The other thing that you can do is vendors. When you buy products, don't buy from all over the place. Get 3 bids on everything. Whenever you go out to buy a treadmill, whenever you go out to buy some toilet paper, get 3 bids, 3 prices. Competition makes people reduce their prices in your favor. Rule of thumb in our company was we never let you buy anything until you got 3 prices on it. Didn't mean you always took the lowest, but it didn't matter whose you took, it would be lower than if you just went to them. So make it competitive. You don't think your consumers, when they come to trial your club, don't shop you against someone else and try to work price against you? If they do it, you should do it. So for example, at Club Corp, I negotiated contracts with every equipment manufacturer. I only allowed us to buy treadmills from I have 200 clubs. Two companies for treadmills, 2 for free weights, 2 for massage tables. What it allowed me to do was get favorable pricing. So for example, and I know that maybe in the US, if you bought a brand new Star Trac treadmill, an iTreadmill with the iPod compatibility and a machine that talks to you, retail price is $10,000. I paid $4,600 for the treadmill because I agreed that we would just buy Star Trac treadmills. I saved $5,400 a treadmill. We're almost saying, boy, let's get Steve to work with. And that's what I did. I did the exact same thing with toilet paper and towels. Why? Because that's managing my expenses. So that's that. And believe it or not, I am going to finish, I believe, on time, to the joy and pleasure of my hosts. But I do want, before I go, I want to say what an honor it has been to be invited to Argentina. Thank Guillermo, but more importantly, to thank each of you. You know that we're all in the same, we have a passion for the same thing as fitness. In his book, Funky Business, he talks about the thing that you got to leverage is what are called tribes. Tribes are people with same interests, same passions. Well, to me, it's an honor to be a part of such a fantastic group. I really thank you. I hope when Justin comes up here, you'll give him a warm Argentinian welcome. And thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. You get, I know they'll announce it, but I'm going to tell you, I know you get a few minutes break before, go take a stretch, do whatever you have to do. I know the cobwebs are rattling now that you've had to listen to financial, but now you get to listen to marketing, which is a whole lot more exciting. Thank you.